A street thug thought he could intimidate a royal guard with threats and a punch. But one precise strike later, he was on the ground, spitting out his own teeth. Here's how it all went down. Before we continue, let us know in the comments below where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another incredible story, showcasing the bravery and discipline of the Royal Guard. You won't want to miss it. The summer heat bore down mercilessly on the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Maurice Stone shouldered his way through the crowd of tourists. His 6'3" frame, hardened by years of street fights, rather than disciplined training, cast an imposing shadow across families trying to capture their holiday photos. "Move it," he growled, shoving past a young mother who'd been too slow to pull her children aside. The smell of cheap beer and stale cigarettes followed in his wake, a sharp contrast to the pristine grounds of the Pal. His knuckles, scarred from countless bar brawls, flexed unconsciously as he scanned the area with predatory intent. The morning crowd parted instinctively before him, recognizing the familiar tension that preceded violence. Marcus's tank top revealed arms covered in crude tattoos, each one a testament to nights spent proving his dominance in back alley scuffles. His eyes, bloodshot from a morning spent in London's roughest pubs, carried the dangerous glint of someone looking for trouble. Bloody tourists. He spat on the immaculate stones, his London accent thick with contempt, standing around like sheep, taking pictures of what his gaze swept across the palace walls, with the same dismissive sneer he'd perfected in countless confrontations. Just some fancy prison with fancy guards in it. A group of school children hurried past their teacher, guiding them away from Marcus's intimidating presence. He tracked their movement with a harsh laugh, the sound carrying across the courtyard like broken glass. "That's right. Run along. Teach them early what real power looks like." His heavy boots scraped against the courtyard stones as he continued his aggressive patrol of the grounds, each step deliberate, as if marking his territory. The morning sun caught the brass knuckles partially visible in his back pocket, not a fashion statement, but a tool he'd used often enough to consider an extension of himself. "Watch yourself," he snarled at an elderly gentleman who'd failed to move quickly enough. The old man's military bearing and quiet dignity only seemed to fuel Marcus's growing agitation. Something about order, about respect, about discipline, seemed to set his teeth on edge, like an itch he could only scratch with violence. That's when Marcus's eyes locked onto the Royal Guard standing at attention. The guard's perfect posture and immaculate uniform presented everything Marcus despised: discipline. Authority earned respect. The morning sun caught the guards' brass buttons and medals, their gleam somehow making Marcus's scowl deepen into something ugly. Well, he drawled his voice, carrying deliberately across the courtyard. "Look what we got here." He began circling the guard like a shark, each step calculated to intimidate another, one of them toy soldiers standing pretty for the cameras. The guard remained motionless, but there was something in his bearing, a subtle tension visible only to those who knew what to look for, that spoke of years of real combat experience. His eyes fixed forward with parade ground. Precision had seen things Marcus couldn't imagine in his worst bar fights. "Oi, mate." Marcus moved closer, deliberately invading the guard's space. The smell of stale beer grew stronger as he leaned in his face inches from the guards. "What's wrong, too?" "Posh." To answer, his boots scuffed against the courtyard stones as he planted himself directly in front of the guard blocking tourists' photos. Two elderly veterans, who had been watching from nearby, straightened their backs, their own military bearing evident in their posture. One touched his campaign medals, unconsciously recognition flickering in his eyes, not of Marcus's attempted show of strength, but of the quiet power in the guard's disciplined stance. "You think you're special, don't you, Marcus?" continued his voice, rising with each word. "Standing here in your fancy dress playing soldier, while real men do real fighting. He gestured to his own scarred knuckles, proud badges of street violence that seemed suddenly childish next to the guards' earned medals. The mourning crowd began to shift uneasily, recognizing the familiar tension that preceded violence. Parents guided their children away, while other tourists created a subtle cirque of space around the unfolding scene. A palace security officer in the distance had noticed the commotion and was speaking into his radio, but Marcus was too focused on his target to notice what's the matter. "Soldier boy," he waved his hand in front of the guard's face, close enough that his knuckles nearly brushed the brim of the bear skin cap. "Can't speak, can't move, or just scared?" His laugh was harsh against the dignified backdrop of Buckingham Palace. "Yeah, that's it. In it. Hide behind that uniform, 'cause you ain't got nothing else." The guard remained motionless, but there was a change in the air, subtle but palpable, to those who understood real strength, the kind of strength forged in battle, not in bar fights, the kind that didn't need to be proven through petty provocations. "You know what I think?" Marcus spat on the ground near the guard's polished boots, his face contorting with growing rage at being ignored. "I think you're just another pretend soldier, but you've never even been in a real fight. Not like me." He flexed his fingers, muscle memory from countless street brawls making them itch for violence. "Maybe it's time someone showed you what a real man can do." The veterans exchanged glances, years of military experience telling them what was coming. They didn't envy to intervene. Something in the guard's bearing told them he needed no protection, but they stayed close, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. Marcus's face had darkened to an ugly shade of red, his ego bruised by the guard's continued silence. He began bouncing on the balls of his feet, a boxer's stance that spoke more of back alley brawls than trained discipline. "Listen up, everyone," he announced to the growing crowd, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man who'd run out of patience. "Your fancy guard here is about to learn what happens when you ignore the wrong bloke." His fingers curled into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening with barely contained rage. The guard remained at attention, but there was something lethal in his stillness, now like a coiled spring, under perfect control. His parade ground stance masked years of combat training. The morning sun caught his campaign medals, ribbons that spoke of battles in distant lands, where the stakes were higher than a thug's wounded pride. "Last chance, soldier boy." Marcus circled closer, his movements becoming more predatory. With each step, "Show me something." A blink, a twitch, anything. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead, whether from the summer heat or growing frustration. It was hard to tell. "Or are you just going to stand there and take what's coming?" The older veteran shifted his weight, recognition flickering in his eyes. He'd seen that stance before in places where combat wasn't a game, and consequences were measured in blood. The guard's stillness wasn't the rigid posture of ceremony anymore. It was the calculated patience of a predator letting its prey move into position. "You think that uniform protects you?" Marcus's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Think those medals make you special?" His right hand clenched and unclenched rhythmically, a tell that any trained fighter would have recognized. "Let's see how special you feel with a few teeth missing." The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the building tension. Some had phones raised, but most stood in uncomfortable silence, witnessing the prelude to violence they could sense was coming. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve, asking in a whispered voice why the bad man was being so mean. The father didn't answer, his own face tight with concern. Marcus rolled his shoulders, the motion rippling through his tank top like a wave of barely contained violence. "Time's up." Soldier, his feet shifted into a wider stance. Telegraph his intentions to everyone except himself. "Let's see what they teach you in guard school." About his words cut off as he drew back his fist. The movement telegraphed like a beginner's mistake. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked, but somehow his stillness seemed to have taken on a different quality, less ceremonial, more tactical. Anyone with real combat experience would have recognized the subtle shift in his weight, the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, that spoke of trained reflexes, waiting to be unleashed. Marcus's fist flew through the air with all the finesse of a pub brawler, telegraphed wide and fueled more by anger than technique. The punch connected with the guard's jaw in a moment that seemed to freeze time, the impact echoing across the suddenly silent courtyard. The guard's head snapped to the side, more from the natural absorption of the blow than any real damage. His bare skin cap didn't even shift, secured by a chin strap that had seen far worse than a street thug's attempt at violence. A single drop of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, bright red against his composed features. Marcus crowed, shaking out his hand with a grimace that betrayed the pain of striking something far more solid than he'd expected. Not so special now, are you? His voice carried a desperate edge of triumph, like a man trying to convince himself he'd won something meaningful. The guard's head slowly returned to its forward position, his movements so deliberate it seemed mechanical. The drop of blood tracked down his chin, staining the pristine white of his collar strap with a single crimson dot. His eyes, which had remained fixed forward throughout the assault, suddenly shifted to lock onto Marcus's face. The change was subtle but profound. Gone was the ceremonial statue, replaced by something that made the watching veterans take an instinctive step backward. They recognized that look. They'd seen it in places where combat wasn't a game, where men like Marcus were considered little more than annoying flies to be swatted. That all you got? Marcus taunted, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. Something about the guard's reaction, or lack thereof, had thrown him off balance. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People were supposed to fall when he hit them, supposed to show fear, or at least pain. The guard's composure was like a mirror, reflecting all of Marcus's inadequacies. Back at him, the crowd had gone, deathly quiet. Parents covered their children's eyes, tourists lowered their phones, and even the birds seemed to hold their song. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, turning the scene into a tableau of mismatched opponents, one fueled by cheap beer and misplaced anger, the other forged in the fires of real combat. Blood continued to track down the guard's chin, but his expression hadn't changed. If anything, his posture seemed to have become more refined, more precise, as if the punch had simply reminded him of standards learned in places where violence had real meaning. The single red drop fell from his chin, landing with perfect precision on his brass button, where it caught the sunlight. Like a ruby, Marcus's moment of triumph was already souring, turning to confusion and then to renewed anger, as he realized his best shot had done nothing more than decorate the guard's uniform with a single drop of blood. His fists clenched again, muscles bunching, as he prepared to throw another punch to prove to himself and his audience that he was still the one in control. That's when the guard spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced far worse than barroom bullies. The words that came out of his mouth would change everything. You hit like a woman. The guard's voice cut through the tension, each word precisely measured and delivered with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. His eyes hadn't moved from Marcus's face, but now they carried an intensity that made the bully take an involuntary step backward. The guard's posture shifted subtly, not breaking protocol, but adjusting it to accommodate what was about to come. I could have stopped that punch before it left your shoulder. His voice carried the weight of experience, not boasting but simple truth. Seen it coming from the moment you started. Posturing, amateur form, predictable angle, all power, and no technique. Marcus's face flushed darker, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was the guard's eyes.
eyes that had seen real combat, real consequences, real death. "You're lying," he managed, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "You just stood there and took it like a, like a trained soldier." The guard's voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath the composure. "Now let me explain something to you about real combat, son. While you were practicing your pub brawls, I was in Helmand province, watching RPGs tear through armored vehicles. While you were picking fights with drunks, I was carrying wounded mates through sniper fire." The veterans nearby nodded slowly, recognition in their eyes. They knew that tone, the voice of someone who had seen the world's darkest corners and returned carrying weights that thugs like Marcus couldn't comprehend. "That punch," the guard continued, the blood on his collar now dried to a dark stain. "I've taken worse hits from children in war zones. Your street fighting means nothing to someone who's had to hold a friend's arteries closed while waiting for medevac. Your attempts at intimidation." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, making the dried blood crack slightly. "I've stared down suicide bombers with more conviction than you'll ever possess." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the guard wasn't finished. "Protocol dictates that we maintain our post, show discipline, embody the traditions we represent. So I let your punch land. Compared to mortar fire, bullets snapping past your head, watching brothers fall." He paused. "Compared to real combat, you're just a child throwing a tantrum." The crowd had drawn closer, pulled in by the quiet authority in the guard's voice. Marcus's swagger now looked hollow, but protocol also allows for an appropriate response to physical assault. The guard continued, voice dropping. "Since you only understand violence, it's time I demonstrate what a real soldier can do." His stance shifted a fraction. Veterans in the crowd recognized it instantly. The calm before impact. "You wanted my attention," he said. "Congratulations, you have it. Now watch the difference between playground posturing and provoking someone who's seen real war." The punch that followed was nothing like Marcus's wild swing. It was precise, controlled, devastating. Power rose from the guard's feet through a frame honed by years of service. There was no wasted motion, just one clean strike. Marcus's head snapped back, his legs buckled, and he staggered, blood filling his mouth as his hands flew to his jaw. Whatever words he tried to form dissolved into broken sounds. "That," the guard said calmly, already returning to posture, "is how a soldier throws a punch. Notice the difference." Two officers moved in, supporting Marcus as he sagged between them, leaving a trail on the stones. "We'll need a statement later," one told the guard, but everyone saw this was self-defense. The guard resumed his post, eyes forward, as if nothing had happened. True strength, the onlookers realized, wasn't in violence, but in the discipline to control it, and the certainty to unleash it only when necessary.